Alright, sweetie. Look. Let me step out real quick for me. Alright. Hey, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna move over around to the front of you, okay? I'm gonna move the handcuffs around to the front of you. Okay. Alright. Alright, so what we're gonna do here is we're gonna swab your hands, okay? Right. I don't ask you a bunch of questions, but obviously you fired with a pistol, correct?
Yes.
Hi guys, welcome back. Today's case is so current. It's recently just been tried. The verdict has only just occurred and it's one that I've followed. It's one that I still, even though I've followed this case, feel a level of conflict over, and we can explore that together today. Before we kick off with today's true crime case, I am indeed sat here in my new merch, and I do actually have the star of such merch with me at this moment in time. Yes, Chase, here he is. This is actually a picture of him that then we made into a cartoon. So it is genuinely Chase merch. Also, should you want to pick up a copy of The Serial Killer Next Door book, then it is available. It will be coming out as a softback in the future, about 3 months' time. But for now, you can only get it on audiobooks or hardback. Also, if you fancy catching me in theatres in the UK, I'm everywhere this year and next year. Still doing my Serial Killer Next Door and Killer Cults at the moment, but Killer Couples is coming next year, and it is insane the amount of dates I have. So please catch me somewhere near you in the UK. Right, let's talk about today's true crime case. And for those of you who want to see more of my cases, by the way, I do actually have a YouTube community and a Patreon, and I release content full length every single week there as well. So if you do like what you're seeing, feel free to go and check that out. Let's talk about Carly Gregg, who this case is about. She was 14 at the time of her crime, and it's a really serious crime as well. She lived on Ashton Way, that's just outside Jackson, Mississippi, and she lived with her mother, a woman called Ashley Smylie, who was 40, also her stepfather, Heath Smiley, who was 38. One of the things that's very clear from the research that I've done is that Carly Gregg had a really strange relationship with her biological father, a guy called Kevin Gregg. He reportedly struggled with substance abuse, and just taking some of the quotes from Carly Gregg's stepfather, he said that basically her biological father had been addicted to pretty much every and any substance that he had come across. So clearly Kevin Gregg had issues, and for his daughter, that was the problem. We can all appreciate that we want parents who love us, make us feel safe, give us a foundation of security, and when that isn't present and when that's problematic, it can cause attachment issues without a doubt. So even though she has a relatively secure home with her stepfather and her mother, she's had a challenging start to some degree. She attended Northwest Rankin High School. That's actually where her mum taught geometry, so she was a maths school teacher. And Ashley was so well loved. As a school teacher, she was said to be really kind, really excellent at what she was able to teach. She was one of those teachers that could get things across easily. And in 2022, she was named New Teacher of the Year. Apparently, she was really, really well loved by her students. And just to make it clear from the get-go, from what I understand, she was also loved by her daughter. So from the information I've managed to garner, I genuinely consider Carly Gregg had a good relationship with her mum. Now, Carly Gregg is one of those overachievers. I would say she was an incredible student. Age 13, she scored 30 on the ACT. But I think a lot of us consider very bright children in a mythical way. So psychologically, we assume that because they find academia easy, that's going to make school an easy experience. But I've worked with overachievers, as I have underachievers in my psychological career, and many of them feel like they are literally running the gauntlet on a daily basis because there are huge expectations of children who are naturally bright, and they put a lot of pressure on themselves, and you're still going through all of the problems that your peers are going through, even if you are academically amazing. And you sometimes have the analysis ability, brain-wise, that far exceeds your actual chronological years, which means that you spend time really over-questioning and over-calculating your actions and who you are and where you want to be, and that can cause a whole heap of additional pressure. So even though at 13 she's scoring 30 on the ACT, it doesn't translate to her necessarily being very happy. And Like a lot of young teenagers, she starts to have some behavioural issues, some troubling signs, shall we say, and they included a history of depression, self-harm and substance abuse. Now that's a big deal. Somebody who is 13, 14 years of age, when they are self-harming, when they are using drugs, when they are feeling really depressed, there's a lot for them to manage. And even when you're working with individuals in this way, you have to recognize therapeutically there's a lot to unpack, because children who are 13, 14 years of age, they haven't had a long distance in life. They haven't the years that help them to navigate and understand the complexities of just existing. And sometimes existing can be unbelievably painful and complicated and multi-layered and really confusing. And when you're struggling with all of that and you're very, very bright as well, that can mean that you spend a lot of time in your head. And when you spend a lot of time in your head, emotionally, you can struggle on a range of levels because you're so thought orientated and you're so overwhelmed by all of the chaos that's going on there. And that obviously links to our emotional self and how we feel, that you can look for ways to escape. So when I hear that she had a history of depression, but then she's using self-harm as a means to manage, because that's what self-harm is, it's a terrible coping strategy. But the reality is, at least it's a coping strategy. Somebody is trying to figure things out and figure a better way to manage than dealing with the horrible thoughts that they have in their head. And that overwhelming feeling makes people feel like they're going to lose it to some degree. So they translate that it's going to be easier to make something physical than to actually stay stuck in the drowning and suffocating feelings that are flooding their mind and their body. And whilst, like I said, it's not a good coping strategy, it's not okay to just say, well, that's a stupid thing to do. They're doing it to survive. And also, when you hear about substance abuse at this age, that speaks to me again about just wanting to get out of whatever state she felt she was in. And even though, again, substance abuse is a terrible thing to be engaged in when you're a young person, it speaks of somebody wanting to escape their state. And that means that she's not coping mentally and she's not coping emotionally. Now, people had obviously been concerned about Gregg. She'd been seeing a therapist and she'd been prescribed medication for anxiety and for depression. I have my own thoughts and feelings about this, and everybody else is entitled to theirs. I actually am horrified that we have young people on treatments for anxiety and depression at 13. You are hormonally shifting. You are going through all of the changes in your academic life and your social life and your relational experience. Of course, you're going to have a level of anxiety. Of course, you're going to have a level of depression. We need to help you get through those and form coping strategies for them instead of getting you on drugs at 13 years of age. That's my thoughts and feelings from my professional experience. Anybody else's ideas are welcome here too. But she was put on Lexapro and Zoloft. I genuinely feel concerned that that was the case, but nonetheless, this is where we are. The reason I feel that is being a teenager is full of a range of different feelings and emotions, and some of them are powerfully overwhelming and some of them are very challenging, but they exist because we're figuring things out. And what we need when we're struggling is for somebody to help us figure those things out, not to numb them, not to push them away or place them to the side of what we're dealing with, because that fundamentally doesn't help us to manifest how to cope. There are lots of people who are really pro-medication, I get it. It's just not something I think we should be giving children. I think there are better ways forward. Now, Gregg had some incidents at school, minor incidents to some degree. She brought in a Swiss Army knife to school. She'd also used burner phones because she had secret communications, likely because of the drugs that she was using. And whilst that can seem very suspicious on one level, it can also be considered completely typical because teenagers know that parents get onto them, and it's good to be able to speak to somebody that your parent isn't going to grab your phone and have a look because she knows the passcode into your phone. So you keep these kind of burner phones secret so that you can chat with whoever you like. But it also speaks of a potential suspicious nature, a paranoid nature. And certainly when we think about paranoia and suspicious thoughts, well, we could be talking about a young person who's dealing with some quite severe mental health issues. She was described by people who knew her and who know her as a sweet little girl. I'm taking a direct quote, but she was emotionally considered somebody who was very troubled, She had a lot of signs of sadness. She had a lot of mood swings. I'm sure if any of you have been following this, watching the things that we've seen from court, when you are watching her in court, you just can't help but feel that some of her mannerisms and body language and facial expressions feel a little bit strange, particularly in the context of what is being discussed in the courtroom itself. If you haven't watched those extracts, if you haven't watched those videos, then it may be worth going and having a look so you really understand what I'm talking about. Let's talk about the fateful day, the awful day, which is why I'm telling the story. So on the 19th of March 2024, Carly Gregg returns home from school. She's with her mother. Now, what she doesn't know is that very same day, a friend of hers, a close friend of hers, had basically spoken to her mother, Ashley, about her worsening drug habits. So Greg's got these issues around smoking weed. She was smoking weed multiple times a week. And this friend felt that she was becoming dependent, reliant on it, so to speak, was so concerned that they felt they needed to actually tell her mother so that her mother could create an intervention. And you can imagine that friend is doing what is best for Greg at that moment in time. Equally, it would be something that most young people would struggle with. If one of your friends has gone and spoken to your mum about your apparent drug habit and one that you're trying desperately to keep quiet, that is going to be something that could definitely provoke and promote conflict. Equally, we all need friends who make us shape up. We all need friends who say things that we need to hear even when we don't want to hear them. So clearly this person has absolutely got the best interests of Greg at heart. So when Ashley and Greg go home, we can understand that Ashley's probably been gestating on this information all day, is probably feeling really upset with the fact that her daughter has gone ahead and done something she disapproves of, and also that it's something that can really compromise her daughter's life, her education, her experience in this world. So she waits until they get back into the home, and at this point she allegedly confronts her daughter about the drug use. She also searched Greg's room and she reportedly found vape pens, which she then, understandably and rightfully so, confiscated. Now, one of the things that we're seeing in our modern era more and more is footage that is shot in the home, because a lot of people for security now have video cameras in their homes, and that's exactly what happens in this case. So that footage actually shows Greg going left out of view into her mother's bedroom. Now, the reason that she went into that bedroom was to specifically retrieve a .357 Magnum, and that .357 Magnum was underneath Ashley's bed. To make it clear, Ashley's family had quite a pro-gun belief system. They felt that they had a right to protect themselves, and it was a pro-gun household, shall we say. So it was not unusual that guns were in that house, and clearly Greg knew where they were. Now, this was allegedly kept under the bed, and the main reason and motivation that Ashley had it there was because she was apparently terrified of Greg's biological father. So she was worried that he might come into the house at some point. She'd need to defend herself. That's why it was there. And clearly, there is not a concern in Ashley's mind that Greg should be aware of where that gun is, because it's clear that she knows. So she mustn't have felt particularly threatened by her daughter until this point. Now, when Greg comes back into shot, she's then able to be seen holding the object behind her back, and then she peers into the kitchen, and then she just strides towards her mother. 3 gunshots are then heard on the tape. The first is followed by a horrific scream, and then there's eerie silence. Ashley was actually shot twice in the face and once below the chin. Greg is then seen really calmly walking into the kitchen to just sit down. And what she also starts to do at that point is text on her phone. She's even singing to the 2 family dogs, which again, if you just think about what I've described, this young girl has gone and taken a gun from her mother's bedroom, has then shot her mother in the face several times, and then she's texting on her phone and she's singing to the family dogs. It's disturbing. It also feels uncanny that that's how it played out. It feels like there's a lack of expected reaction from Greg. She then tears down the CCTV camera that's located in the kitchen, and she actually hides it in the fridge. I guess we could say that that's probably her thinking she doesn't know what to do with it, she needs to get rid of it, she's aware that she's been filmed, so the fridge is there and it's got enough room for her to shove it in there. Another person could say, well, that could be considered nonsensical, like she's not processing the world appropriately at that moment in time. Now, one of the people that she texts, will give that person the pseudonym BW, which they did in court. They are asked by her to come over. And the reason that they're asked to come over is she says to them that there's an emergency. Now, that friend is a good friend. So they go ahead, come to her home to check that she's okay. When Gregg meets them, she says to that girl, have you ever seen a dead body before? And then she actually goes ahead and shows her friend her mother's body. Now, I cannot even begin to imagine where the mindset of that friend is. She's gone over to the house because she's worried about her friend, and her friend says there's an emergency, and she's had the good grace, goodwill, and courage to go and to help her. And then all of a sudden, she's being asked whether she can deal with gory situations. And then she's literally shown the dead body of a friend's mother, probably somebody that she knew. That will be traumatizing beyond belief. And also, how do you react in that situation? Clearly, the friend would likely want to call 911 or at least their parents. But in that moment, you're dealing with your friend who you have a relationship with. The scene that's unfolding in front of you, your head is literally going to emotionally fall off and you will not know what to do. And then she allegedly told that same friend there were 2 for the head and 1 for the chest waiting for Heath when he returned to the home. So she's indicating she has a full intention of killing her own stepfather. Now, that friend would not have a clue how to act in this situation. You're just hoping this is a nightmare that you'll wake up from, as opposed to this is actually playing out in front of you and there is another potential victim on their way home. Gregg had also texted her stepfather from her mum's phone asking, when will you be home, honey? So she's lured him into a situation where he genuinely believes that he's coming home to his loving partner, not knowing that his loving partner has been shot 3 times in the face. At this point, Gregg waits in the kitchen for Heath to return from work. Just waiting. As soon as he opens the door, Gregg shoots him in the shoulder. Now, despite that injury, Heath, thank the Lord, managed to wrestle the gun away from Gregg, but she manages to fire 2 more shots. Gregg then just flees the scene, and fortunately at this point, Heath is still able to call 911 for help. But it's a very close call. She clearly intended that her stepfather was going to die that day, as well as her mother. Now, at this point, Gregg just flees the scene on foot, and the security footage from the house actually shows her running from the property. And one of the things that Heath recalled when he's questioned about the state she was in, he said that Gregg just seemed to be in a state of terror. So he didn't in any moment, both then and recalling it later, feel that she was in a normal mindset to any degree. In fact, he describes her as almost seeming possessed in that moment. So now Gregg has fled in one direction. Her friend who'd been brought to the scene of the crime fled in another direction, but it doesn't take the police long to apprehend her. And they actually found her walking along a nearby road. She appeared really disorientated. She appeared very confused. And one of the things that the officers who actually met her said was there just seemed to be this level of disconnection, both from her surroundings, but also from the very serious gravity of the situation. So when they actually asked her if she was okay, she really calmly replied, yeah, I'm fine. Now, as she was having her hands swabbed for a gunpowder residue test, Gregg actually asked the officers, is my stepdad okay? She also said that she had literally no idea which hand she'd used to fire the gun. So she's quite vague about how things had played out and her recollection of the event. When it came down to the police interview, again, there were lots of signs of confusion. There was a clear lack of emotion. This is both during her arrest and also in the very early stages of her interrogation. And that confusion seems to be endemic within her from the moment this crime was carried out all the way through the trial with respect. She's confused and disorientated at times, like I said, when this has been played out in court. But at the very get-go, One of the things that she struggles with is to detail what happened in the shootings. She just couldn't remember the events very, very clearly. It was misty for her. Now, Gregg was detained at Rankin County Juvenile Detention Center. She was charged immediately with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and also tampering with evidence. As we know, she pulled the camera down, etc., so that would fit into that category. Now, in August 2024, Gregg was actually offered a plea deal. That plea deal would have seen her sentenced for 40 years in prison, obviously because of the murder of her mother and the attempted murder of her stepfather. It's very serious charges. And when you think about the states and the kind of sentences that you can get, which go into the hundreds of years, 40 years for a homicide and an attempted homicide, it does seem relatively reasonable. But on the 27th of August 2024, this is despite Gregg's legal team recommending she take the deal. And we all know why defense teams say you should take a deal. It's because the defense team's like, I don't think we're going to get a better deal. It's as simple as that. The reality is, if your team, on the whole at least, are saying, look, we really think this is a decent deal, take it. If you say no, then be it on your head, because they are legally schooled. And if they see a deal that seems good and fair and actually positive for you, that could mean you'll walk the streets again. Bear in mind, she's 14 when she actually committed this crime. So yeah, she would lose her childhood and her young adulthood. But at the end of the day, if you're getting out in your 50s, you have a whole heap of living to do. So she would have had a potential freedom, and they knew that. But she refused it. So they opted instead at this point to take the case to trial because of her wishes. Now that means immediately that there is a likelihood that she could receive a possible life sentence. And like I said, 40 years, it seems like a long time. But if you're going to be in 80, well, it feels like a really good deal. But Gregg didn't want to go with it. On the 29th of August, Gregg underwent a mental health evaluation. Now, this is just before her trial began. Understandably, it's really imperative, particularly when you're dealing with somebody who's so young, that they make sure that they understand if there is anything deeper going on physiologically, neurologically, etc. Now, the defense, they pushed for a real focus on her mental health issues. They felt that that was the crux of their argument, and they felt that if they could concentrate focus on the fact that she had quite severe mental health issues, there's a potential that they could reduce the charges. But on the 30th of August, Gregg was actually found fit to stand trial. Now, those of you who come to this channel know that it is very rare that someone is not given the fitness to stand trial. It's a really high bar, and you can be mentally really struggling and be suffering a severe mental illness and still be considered fit to stand trial. So we're not talking about her going in there and being completely compos mentis. Just when it comes down to the bar and achieving that level of being fit, they say she is. Now, Gregg was actually tried as an adult because she actually committed the crime at 14. Now, this means that her age, I would say, becomes a point of contention to some degree. So in Mississippi, minors can be tried as adults in severe cases like murder. So it's possible. Now, the prosecution said, listen, this is a crime that needs to be tried in this manner because she had premeditation. They said retrieving the gun, attempting to cover up the crime, that indicated adult level responsibility. They're basically saying, listen, she knew what she was doing. She absolutely was aware of her actions. She planned it in that moment. Bear in mind, premeditation just means that you have to plan it. It doesn't have to be a long, protracted, drawn-out process. As long as you thought about it and they can evidence that you've thought about it, they can try you for that. She also waited to then try to kill her stepfather. She texted friends and so on and so forth. So they're basically saying this young person is absolutely culpable and she needs to stand in a way that evidences that culpability. So prosecutors basically drew the attention to the fact that she was texting her friends after the murder, that she was acting like nothing had happened. And so they do that successfully. And at this point, Gregg's case is escalated to adult court. And as we know, with adult court comes adult consequences legally. The trial commenced on the 16th of September 2024. It began in Rankin County. The prosecution was led by Catherine Newman and Michael Smith. The defence was Bridget Todd and the judge was Julie Arthur. The prosecution, I would say, showed no mercy whatsoever. So in the opening statements, Newman immediately established that the murder was premeditated. They said Carly didn't just snap. She planned this. She knew exactly what she was doing. Also really concentrated focus on what they described as Gregg's chilling behaviour after she killed her own mother. They described it as being highly callous. The defence, however, they said, listen, this looks terrible, but we need you to consider Gregg's mental state. They said she'd suffered from depression, from auditory hallucinations for years, and that her prescribed medications had actually worsened her condition. They said this was not a calculated act of violence, but the tragic result of a mind in turmoil. Carly didn't need punishment, she needed help. That was their defense, that was the road they were traveling. Now, the prosecution case, as I say, was relatively strong because they have it all on video and because of the fact that she's texting people and she's waiting to actually go ahead and try and kill her stepfather. Now, the emergency dispatcher, Kevin Collins, he was the first prosecution witness, and the 911 call was played for the jury. And Gregg's actually seen crying whilst he's listening to it. Heath, who has obviously been through a horrific trauma and he's been shot himself, he can actually be heard sounding hysterical. He's frantic. He's saying Gregg shot him and that she's killed her mother. But then they have body cam footage. So the body cam footage from the first deputy who arrived at the scene, that's shown to the jury, that identified the officer as Rankin County Patrol Deputy Hunter Lewis. And Lewis said that when he arrived at the home, the front door was actually locked, but he could hear someone screaming, as he put it, hysterically inside of the house. And footage actually showed Heath falling to the ground while he's trying to explain hysterically to Lewis that his wife Ashley was dead. And it also shows Lewis making his way through the house, which is where he finds Ashley, and she's lying on her back in Gregg's room. She had a bloody towel draped over her face. And Lewis said that he'd actually lifted that towel to discover that Ashley had a bullet in her head. So clearly from that, we also know that Gregg must have put that towel over her mother's face. And that again draws us to the conclusion that to some degree she must have known what she was doing, because once she'd done it, she obviously didn't like what it looked like, so she'd covered her mother's head. It's quite an intimate action. Somebody who isn't connected to that person wouldn't care. But there's something in that talks of the relationship between Ashley and Gregg, because there's obviously an overwhelming reality when she's killed her mother that her mother looks bad, so she's draped the towel over her. But that must have been absolutely harrowing for Heath to actually come into and discover, and equally for Lewis, the officer who attended the scene, to discover Ashley in that state. Now, that body cam footage was played for 30 to 40 minutes, then it was cut off by the prosecution. But you can understand, as a jury, that is compelling. That is really compelling. You're looking at those events play out as they played out in real time on that day, and you're part of it. And I think we rarely consider just how different it is for juries now in the present day compared to how it was 30 or 40 years ago. 30 or 40 years ago, you're hearing evidence secondhand. You might be seeing photographs. You can't piece it together. You can't hear the hysteria that I've just described and see it play out in Technicolor. If you're sitting on a jury and you're watching this happening and you're being with the victims, both the one who's dead, the one who's screaming, and you're watching it play out in front of you and you're present, therefore, you're witnessing it, that's going to impact on the way that you feel. I think it's impossible not to form a level of absolute understandable bias when you're actually watching things like that. And it's interesting to me to consider what kind of impact that has when we're dealing in cases like this, where somebody is going for the nuance of saying, listen, what she's done is terrible. We can't defend what she did as far as going ahead and killing her mother, but can we take a step back and imagine that potentially there was something deeper going on for this young girl than simply being a cold-blooded killer. If you have seen something that looks like an execution, it's really hard to not then consider that the executioner is indeed cold-blooded. So, like I said, makes me think that it's hard these days when you see all of this information to come to any other conclusion than the court will come to in the case that I'm covering today. The jury, as I said, were also shown multiple text messages that Gregg sent to her friends, and this was, of course, inviting them round to see the aftermath of her crime. The prosecution read one of the messages out. Come over, you have to see this. Now, on one level, what do we think? Sociopathic killer. An individual so antisocial that even when they have carried out the ultimate slaying of their own parent, they're proud of it. Or we could look at it from a slightly different angle and say, this seems like really weird behavior. When it comes down to psychopathic serial killers, for example, they don't go around showing people their work on the whole because they know it's game over, they'll be in trouble. In fact, lots of serial killers get away with killing because of the fact that they keep it so secret and they're very astute at being sophisticated in that manner. Texting your friends to say, come over and see what I've done, it feels really dysfunctional psychologically. I'm not saying that she's not sociopathic. I'm just saying there is an oddness to that behavior. That noted, she's a young person and young people often don't think in consequential ways that adults do. So she could indeed be proud of it. Now, there's also a journal. Prosecutors present this journal to the jury, and this is where Gregg has kept a written list of 5 beliefs. One of the beliefs including that there is no God. Totally contextual. Massive amount of people are atheists these days. That's not my bag. I'm a big believer in the big God, but lots of young people struggle with the idea of a God or an ultimate creator, and lots of people who have great faith question it over time. So you can kind of flux in your belief systems. And like I said, when you're 13, 14 years of age, it is completely normal to question whether there is an existence of a God, particularly in today's political climate where there is almost an affirming of that belief system as opposed to a spiritual one. Now, the prosecutor actually brought to the jury's attention 2 of the final beliefs. The first one, it's okay to be evil, and the second, you don't need a family. Again, really odd to write those down in a journal, but we see that time and time again with killers. For some reason, the musings that they have in their mind, they can't help but put onto paper, and that can often trip them up in the gravest of manners when it comes down to them being incarcerated. Good for us, bad for them. But it's okay to be evil, you don't need a family. I will also throw in, having been a teenager and having worked with many, they at times are quite dramatic and can write things, speak things, discuss things that they would not do in 15 years' time. But there isn't a lot of responsibility at that moment in time when you're 13, 14, 15. So therefore, the excess time that you are granted because of your age, you can fill with a whole heap of drama and things like, I don't need my family, or maybe I was swapped at birth, and all those things that kids can consider and think of. That is stuff that they can also journal. So even though that can seem really incriminating in court, and certainly in light of what she's done, it can also be seen as completely in line with the way that teenagers are. And I'm sure that a lot of you guys can recollect those moments you wrote some pretty dramatic things in your diaries. Now, when it came down to people who testified, Heath Smiley came in and indeed testified. Now, of course, we'd expect that to happen. His wife was brutally murdered by Gregg, and he was almost killed as well. But he doesn't come in all guns blazing. He doesn't come in with a rage and a resentment for Gregg that some of us might expect. In fact, when he spoke about Gregg in court, for example, he said they got along great, and he said that his wife, Ashley, would do anything in the world for Gregg, and that Gregg and Ashley got on incredibly well. He talked through the actual day of the murder. He recounted the morning of the shooting. And Heath said that Ashley had woken up, she'd made tea, she'd headed to Northwest Rankin High School with Gregg in the car. There was literally nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that provoked any concern from him. But at 4:15 p.m, he gets that text message from Ashley's phone that we know Gregg actually sent, the one that said, "Are you almost home, honey?" So Heath actually read that text message aloud to the jury, and he actually responded to it saying, "No, I'll be at work for a little bit." He also sent a thumbs up in the reply. So he goes in with absolutely no idea, no notion of what's played out. He thinks his wife's fine. It's just a normal, typical day. And he said when he arrived home, all he remembered was the gun firing near his face. He said, when I opened the door to the kitchen, the gun went off in my face before the door was even 3 to 4 inches wide. And everything kind of went pretty fast from there. It was just a blur. He said that Gregg was, quote, screaming out of her mind scared. It was like she had a demon or something. And my first thought was, there's an intruder somewhere, and she thought she was after somebody else. So even in that moment where she shot him, he cannot compute that she is capable or has the capacity in any way, shape or form to have actually been the person who caused him the injury. He's convinced in that moment that somebody's come in, maybe harmed her. She's trying to deal with this situation by getting a gun so that she's armed to take on whoever the intruder is. So he's not computing in any moment, at that moment, that she's responsible for what's played out. And Heath's account of finding Ashley's body actually matched Lewis's account as well, the officer who turned up there. So it's clear that he was telling the truth throughout these proceedings in court. Now, during the cross-examination, Todd actually relied on the narrative that some of Gregg's behaviours were actually influenced by her biological father, a guy called Kevin Gregg. So in that cross-examination, he spoke to Heath about the relationship that Kevin Gregg and his daughter, Carly Gregg, had. And he did testify that he wasn't a great father at all. He was constantly doing drugs around Gregg. He even said that her biological father had actually made her drink an entire beer at the age of 12. So a really bad example and role model for her. Also, very conflicting. When you're a young person growing up and you have parents who are very different, if they're split, it even makes it more challenging. But if you have these very different personalities, one of the things that you want as a child is to connect with both parties. You want to be in a relationship that's positive with your mother and in a relationship that's positive with your father. But the duality there is problematic because your father may be completely different to your mother, different expectations, different rules and regulations, different experiences, different attitudes. And all the while, you're trying to clamour for a relationship that's good with both. And that can mean with your mother, you'll act in one direction, and with your father, you'll act in another. And the problem is, therefore, that she's had a taste of both styles. The loose, liberal, free and problematic, i.e. introducing her to alcohol, and the more structured, more responsible, more grown, more academic, which clearly was an environment that her mother provided her with. And another thing that he testified to in court was that he never, ever felt afraid of Gregg at all. He was never scared of her. There was no inclination whatsoever that she was going to carry out the killing of her mother. And he said that even though she had killed his wife, even though she'd attempted to kill him, he still wasn't scared of her. He actually said she's just a sweet little girl. He said that in his history of experience with her, she'd never been angry, she'd never been mad. So this is a complete bolt out of the blue. Now, there are crimes that we hear about that come as a bolt out of the blue. Let's talk about family annihilation, particularly where men kill their children and nobody expected it. But often what you'll hear about is when they analyse the experience within the family network, people will be like, oh, there was some debt, there were some problems, maybe some dependency issues, maybe there were a few relationship issues. And even though you still feel like it was complete bolt out of the blue, there was some kind of jigsaw pieces you can fit in. That's not the case where Gregg's stepfather is concerned looking at her behaviour. She wasn't deeply problematic, no matter the issues and bumps in the road that she'd had. He was never afraid with her. He was never put in a situation where he felt she was highly disrespectful. This is something that's clearly almost impossible for him to compute. Now, when it came down to Gregg's school friends, of course, we know because she was texting them that they're going to give testimony. So BW, that's the person who they didn't publish the name of because of the age, they said that she had known Gregg since the 9th grade. And she'd actually noticed how jittery and how scared and secretive Gregg had sounded on the phone. She said that she didn't actually tell her what was wrong, but she said she couldn't say over the phone what had happened. But Gregg actually told BW there was an emergency and that she needed to come over. So being a lovely friend, at 4:58 p.m, BW sent a text to say, look, I've arrived at the property, I'm here. Now, when she got there, Gregg asked that question. Have you ever seen a dead body before? She said no. She's shown Ashley's body. Gregg then shows her the locations of other guns. Shotgun, there's also a BB gun on the property, and BW testified that Gregg had admitted to shooting a mum 3 times and also had 3 more for Heath. She then asked her if she wanted to go outside while she took care of her stepdad. Now you can imagine where BW is. She's thinking, what the hell is going on? She can't believe this has happened. She knows that her friend is armed, so you're not going to be like, I'm going to try and get into an altercation to disarm you. It could kill you. So she just goes ahead in shock, goes into the backyard, and then clearly to her absolute horror, she hears 3 gunshots. So she realizes that not only has Gregg killed her own mother, as far as she's concerned in that moment, she's likely killed her stepfather too. And apparently Gregg then came outside and met her and then jumped over a fence. They went in separate directions at this point. BW also testified that one of the things that she'd noticed was that in recent weeks, she'd become riskier with her use of drugs. So that escalation that seemed to be happening that her friends were concerned about, it was being noted by other people. Another friend, TG, they testified that Gregg had smoked weed, done cocaine, and also at one point mushrooms. And she is young to be doing that. And if you think about the psychological evidence and the physiological evidence that we have regarding drugs, most people can get away with it. Let's be honest. I'm not going to come on here and lie. We all know, because you'll all know people who take drugs, and some of you will have taken them yourselves. Most people can get away with it. They're okay. They'll recreationally use and will be fine. But if you do have a predisposition for fractures in your foundation where mental health issues are concerned, if you are a young person, particularly those they believe when it comes down to things like schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia, if you're under the age of 14 and you're using things like cannabis, you really are upping your propensity to develop it. And anything that you put into your body up until the age of 25 is going to affect your brain development because your brain isn't fully developed. So when you have complexities within your nature, when you have those fractures in your foundation and you're creating this pen portrait of possibility as to the person you're going to become, clearly these kind of drugs at that age are going to have some kind of impact. And again, it speaks volumes about the fact that Gregg was trying to escape her sense of self to some degree. She didn't like who she was or how she felt. She was trying to figure out a new way of being in those moments, and drugs answered that need temporarily. Now, TG also recounted a time where Gregg had actually alluded to killing Ashley and Heath Smiley. So this guy said he travelled from Columbus to Brandon, Mississippi to visit Gregg. Now, apparently when he arrived, Heath told him that Gregg never actually stayed at the house. So that was confusing for TG. But then Gregg apparently messaged him on a burner phone saying that Ashley was actually holding Gregg down while Heath answered the door. So basically saying that they've lied to you. I am here. You should have been able to come in, but they've not let you come in because clearly they don't want me to see you. And this had led to her saying that she wanted to murder her parents that day. Now, that is very incriminating in light of what we know about what played out. But we also have to be real about teenagers when they're angry. I mean, genuinely, if my parents had died every time I wished them dead when I was 13, well, they would have been dead a lot of times. It's horrible to admit, but I remember saying really awful things when I was a struggling teen. And I'm sure loads of you relate to that. So saying I want to murder my parents, it doesn't actually mean in that moment you want to murder them. But like I said, that's clearly going to add to the prosecution's case because in light of what I'm talking about, that does seem relatively incriminating. But one of the things that's also important to note is that Heath's account of that day was very different to Gregg's. She said, no. It's also worth noting that when Heath was asked about the account of that day, it was very different to Gregg's. Apparently, he said that Gregg didn't want to see the boy who'd turned up for her. And again, that would make sense. The guy goes to the door, stepdad answers, he's been told by Gregg, I don't want to see him. Stepdad makes it easy, she doesn't stay here, and the boy goes away. Then when the boy speaks to Gregg, Gregg is like, oh, I was held down, I couldn't do anything about it, because she just doesn't want to feel embarrassed and shameful about the fact that she didn't want to see him. So that would also make sense. Now, when it comes down to the defence, it's clear from what I've told you so far today that they have got a steep hill to climb to defend any of the actions that Gregg has been involved in, because they are heinous. So they bring in Dr. Andrew Clark. He's an expert witness. He's a child and adolescent psychiatrist. He's based in Cambridge, MA. He basically testified that he diagnosed Gregg with bipolar type 2 disorder. Now, bipolar type 2 disorder, for those of you who don't know, it's more nuanced. I would say it's not as obvious. So one of the things that very much is underdiagnosed, I would say in my experience in mental health issues, is bipolar type 2. He said that he didn't think that Gregg was actually able to even understand the nature of her conduct or to appreciate the difference between right or wrong at the time of a crime. When they looked at Gregg's medical records, it absolutely indicated that she had a really long-standing struggle with depression and anxiety. And even though her school record shows a really excellent pattern of good attendance and academic excellence, it doesn't mean that she was not struggling mentally. Clark also said that Gregg's journal entries and sketchbook had revealed that there were issues. So it revealed that she had quite an interest with dark themes, and that was in line with feeling depressed. He also read aloud a journal entry written on the 12th of March, which was 1 week prior to the crimes. And this is what she'd written. I think I had a psychotic break earlier. The whole ordeal is quite silly. I actually spoke with one of the voices in my head. Well, I didn't hear them until earlier today, but I only do then. My particular friend and I were practically screaming bloodthirstily and ravenously. Thank God. Physical confrontation was not possible. I sound crazy. Now, the fact that she, a week before the murders, is writing about a potential psychotic break, most 13, 14-year-olds don't know what a psychotic break is. So the fact that she is aware of the term psychotic break says to me that she was somebody who'd schooled herself on what this was. She's probably been online, she's asked questions about it, she's looked at her own mental health and tried to figure out what's going on in her brain. And even though we can't say she was going through a psychotic break a week before she killed her mother, there does seem to be some questioning about what's going on for her on a personal level. And she's using the journal as a way of dealing with that. Now, that doctor also said there was a sketch on an undisclosed page written in green ink that apparently appeared to be in different handwriting. And that included statements like, "I don't think I'll make it any longer," and "please help me," which Gregg said that basically she had no idea of. So Clark said that demonstrated that Gregg was worried about her mental health. And I would imagine that Clark is also trying to potentially push this idea that there was some disassociation there. So if you think about dissociative identity disorder, an issue where somebody is taken over by different personalities, that kind of suggestion that she didn't even have the same handwriting, she didn't have any recollection about who was writing that, that could also push that kind of narrative. Clark also testified that in the last year, Gregg had developed what he deemed were common teenage behaviours, like sneaking out of the house and staying up past curfew on a burner phone to text friends, etc. So he's saying, yeah, there are these obvious things as far as he's concerned that suggest and allude to a mental health condition, but there are also things that could be seen entirely contextual with being a teenager. And sometimes that's difficult to differentiate, as I've said. But I do feel that he's right when he's concerned about her noting things like psychotic breaks a week before she goes ahead and kills her mum. Also, Clark told the court that 6 weeks before Gregg's arrest, she was smoking weed about 2 to 4 times a week, which is a lot when you're her age. But this doctor said, listen, she was self-medicating. She was struggling with anxiety. She was struggling with sleeping. And therefore, she was using weed to calm those things down. And I guess there's quite contradictory levels of information advice in the States because, you know, you can smoke weed in places. You can get prescriptions for it if you have sleep issues or migraine in certain places. And young people know that. So it's quite hard to be clear with them about boundaries when they see that other people elsewhere at certain ages are allowed to go off and do what they want. Not young people, but, you know, if you're over 18 and so on and so forth, or over 21, for young people, that's confusing. Well, I've got headaches and I've got sleep issues. I think that it would work for me. Can't get it legally, may as well get it illegally. So like I said, She's using it at quite a high rate for a person of her age, and we know it can have grave consequences for people who struggle with their mental health and have fractures in their foundations mentally as well. Now, during Clark's testimony, he also talked about the history of Gregg. So when she was 4 years of age, she actually had a sister who died, which was totally destabilizing and devastating. And you can imagine that when you're growing up at 4 years of age, you might not have a huge raft of memories, but you can absolutely imagine that you would have had so many connections with your sister at that point, and to suddenly not see them anymore because they've died, and the impact it has on the adults around you because it's just devastating, that can absolutely transition your environment on a whole range of levels, and that trauma will have had an impact. Also, around 6 or 7 years of age, Gregg started hearing voices. She also had intrusive thoughts, which is one symptom of PTSD. And that could absolutely be in line with the fact that she lost a sibling. Then as she grows older, she started to develop symptoms of depression. And when she's 11 or 12, she actually began self-harming. She was making superficial cuts to her thigh. And let me just tell you before I go any further, because I hate it when this kind of reporting happens, and it's happened a lot in this case, can we stop saying superficial cuts when it comes down to self-harming? Because then it makes it out to be like some kind of competition. Everyone has a different pain threshold. If you are somebody with a really high tolerance for pain, then you are not going to be satisfied when you're dealing with the overwhelming pain in your mind and your body because of emotional problems and psychological problems. You are not going to be satisfied by scratching yourself. You're going to do something more significant, which is why people cut more deeply. However, if you are somebody who has a lower pain threshold, you feel pain quite acutely, then scratching is going to serve the same purpose. But when we start using the words like superficial, it makes it seem like it's not really that bad. It's absolutely that bad. When somebody is in so much pain emotionally that they are harming their body, that is really bad. They're not doing it for attention, no matter what people say, no matter what people talk about and minimize. They're doing it because they are in emotional torment. And we shouldn't say things are superficial, because that denies the agony that person's dealing with emotionally. Also, at this point, Gregg's parents actually were told about the self-harm. That was in December 2023. And it did eventuate in a conversation between her and her parents where she admitted she's really depressed. And Ashley, being an amazing mother and a loving parent and somebody who wanted the best for her daughter, she took her to a nurse practitioner and also a therapist, and then they prescribed some medication. Now, Clark said that medication didn't actually have much of an effect, so the dosage was then increased, and then Gregg ended up complaining of feeling numb, which is something that, like I said earlier on, drives me to distraction. Teenagers should not feel numb. They should feel every feeling there is, because they're practicing what they're going to need to deal with when they're older, and they need people to help them navigate, not numb, their emotional vocabulary. And it's really disconcerting for a young person to feel numb because they don't feel involved in anything. It's like being behind glass. You can see everything happening, but you can't feel it. But that's what they did. You basically medicate the young person to feel nothing, so they're not really a problem anymore. But they're absolutely dealing with all the things beneath the surface that were there before you started numbing the pain. And they've still got to confront that, and they're acutely aware it's still there. They just don't quite know where it is anymore and how to get to it and access it. Clark also said that all of those factors, so including the things that I've just covered and Gregg's biological parents divorcing when she was 4 or 5, just was a real contributor to the struggle with her mental health. Some people are able to navigate every struggle and problem with a resilience that is enviable, and genuinely they have positive mindsets and they're well adjusted and they have this incredible ability to just move forward with a smile on their face, learning their lessons and feeling like it's going to prepare them better for the next onslaught of suffering. But for many of us, we're sensitive, and every single knock knocks us down further and impacts on our mental health. And it feels like when we're thinking about Gregg, even though she does come across in court like somebody who just isn't really processing what's happening, you do get the feeling that there was this sensitivity within her nature that she was struggling with that then's been numbed down, and she's somehow got lost a little because of all these struggles. Clark said that she had a really close yet really complicated relationship with her mother, and she also had a close, affectionate relationship with her stepfather. They also noted that she did have a relatively problematic relationship with her biological father because, let's be clear, he's a terrible example of a human. Now, over time, Clark said that she started to have lower lows and also higher highs. And then when Gregg's medication was switched to Lexapro, the voices started to get worse. Now, voices, for anybody who's had to deal with them, when you've got actual auditory hallucinations and you can hear people speaking to you either in your head or externally, and they feel like complete separate entities to you, it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. And it's unbelievably disconcerting and scary to go through that. And to be a young person of very young age, like I was saying before, 6, 7, 8 years of age, she was dealing with those auditory hallucinations. And then as a young teenager, when they're getting worse, you can imagine that she's going to be really destabilized during those moments. And it also makes people on the whole very paranoid, very suspicious. And who do I listen to? Do I listen to the people who I love, who are telling me what to do? Or do I listen to these people who are speaking to me in my head directly? That's a very conflicting experience for anyone. Now, on the 19th of March 2024, Clark, the doctor, said that Gregg had woken up grumpy and irritable, apparently claimed to him that she couldn't focus at school that day. And at the end of the school day, this is when Ashley had informed Gregg that she indeed knew about the marijuana. Clark said that after Gregg made it home, she did recall going in the backyard to let her dogs out, but afterwards her memory basically went blank. But her memory did come back as she was standing by the side of the road. She, at this point, crawled out of a drainage pipe. She was wet, and the police officer came by and picked her up. Now, you can imagine, can't you? As this is going on in court, the prosecution are just sitting there ready for the cross-examination. And I understand why, because there's nothing like someone saying, oh, I don't remember any of the stuff that I did that was bad. I remember the before, I do remember the after, I just don't remember any of the bit where I was actually responsible. It feels a little bit convenient, I get it, and that's exactly what prosecutor Michael Smith noted. He said, how convenient that you could recall what happened before school, what happened during school, what happened when you were arrested, but you couldn't actually recall the hour time span when you allegedly murdered your mother and also tried to murder your stepfather. Feels a little bit, convenient for that. Equally, we can note that people can go through psychotic breaks and they can lose themselves for a period of time and have no recollection, but be absolutely aware of what happened at other points and be very detailed and accurate in the reporting of what happened before and after a certain time frame. So it can happen. Now, they called the rebuttal witnesses, of course they did. So first of all, they called Olivia Lieber. She's a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner. And Lieber stated that she first met with Gregg in January 2024. At this point, Gregg had completed a form and she checked no when asked if she was hearing voices. Now, it could be that she ticked no because in that moment, she wasn't hearing voices. It could be that she ticked no because the voice said, tick no. Genuinely, that can absolutely happen. She also said that Gregg was diagnosed with major depressive disorder and adjustment disorder. For those of you who don't know what adjustment disorder is a group of symptoms such as stress, anxiety, things like feeling sad or hopeless. You can also get physical symptoms that occur with that. You go through a stressful life event, all of those can culminate to do that. And it's basically because you're having a hard time coping. Your adjustment to the situation, it's a much stronger reaction. It's a stronger reaction than is expected for whatever the type of event has occurred. It's over the top, shall we say. And there are lots of different things that can trigger symptoms of an adjustment disorder. Take the obvious ones, death of a loved one, your parents getting divorced, life changes, moving to a different home, that can do it, catastrophes that befall you, financial hardship, all of those things can cause adjustment disorders. And this particular professional said that Gregg had mentioned being depressed, but said it wasn't chronic. And she also denied at this point hallucinations or delusions. Now, in a follow-up appointment in February, Lieber said that Gregg had got no trouble with remote memory and had no abnormal or psychotic thoughts. She also met with Gregg for the last time on March the 12th, which was 1 week before the shootings. At this point, Gregg complained of feeling like a zombie, and Lieber told Gregg to taper off the Zoloft she was taking and to actually begin the new medication, Lexapro. At this point, Gregg didn't report hearing voices or having lapses in memory. Lieber did state, however, if you stop your medication abruptly, there's always a risk for symptoms to come back, maybe worse. And indeed, that's absolutely true. But it doesn't seem like she was having a very straightforward experience whilst taking those drugs. And just because somebody self-reports that they're not hearing voices in that moment or having hallucinations in that moment doesn't mean they aren't. And also, we often see that certain clients will relate differently to certain professionals. If they truly trust you, they might tell you the absolute truth, such as, actually, I am having hallucinations, I am hearing voices. And if they're not too sure of you, they may do the opposite, because suspicious and paranoid thoughts play into these conditions. Now, Rebecca Kirk was also called. She's a licensed professional counsellor. She'd met with Gregg 9 times before the shootings, and Kirk actually stated that in January 2024, both Gregg and her mother, Ashley, reported that she was having these very intrusive and disruptive thoughts. She was apparently easily angered, and she was having trouble sleeping. Gregg, again, at this point, denied hearing voices. Kirk did say that in the final session that they had together, Gregg wasn't experiencing any suicidal or homicidal tendencies, nor did she report any side effects from her meds. Newman, the prosecutor, then asked Rebecca Kirk, as a therapist, how many people do you see that have complaints about depression or anxiety? And Rebecca Kirk replied, almost every single one of them. And the prosecutor then said, and how many of them have gone on to kill their mum? Before that, none, Rebecca Kirk replied. Now, you can see what the prosecution are doing there. They're basically saying for the jury to hear, this woman, this therapist, she speaks to people who are depressed and anxious day in, day out, and she's not dealing with regular homicides. That's how unusual Gregg is, and that's because Gregg is a stone cold killer. That's the line they're drawing. But again, let me bring your attention back to this self-reporting. Just because somebody is sat talking to a therapist saying I'm fine doesn't mean they're fine. In fact, if there is one type of person I can describe to you who will pretend they are 100% fine, who will pretend that they're hearing no voices, who will pretend that they're not visually seeing things that other people can't see, it's somebody who is dealing with psychosis. They are suspicious, they are paranoid, and they don't want anybody to know what's going on because they don't trust the world. So I'm just bringing that in because a counsellor self-reporting this does not make it real. It makes it their experience of having a client who is merely reporting what they are being told by that client. By the way, I'm not defending Gregg at all in this. I'm just bringing it right down to the psychology of this situation, and that's based on me working with young people who have suffered from similar situations in the past, not murdering their family, but doing things that other people would find relatively reprehensible when they are in a psychotic state that everybody believed wasn't happening because that person was able to appear for a period of time as typical. Now, Dr. Jason Pickett, he's a forensic psychologist. He testified regarding the task that he had to perform a mental evaluation on Gregg. He was using a test basically to see if she could be found insane, so she wouldn't have been fit to stand trial. He actually did state that some of Gregg's writings and statements seemed very theatrical and that others were quite concerning. He did review multiple pieces of evidence, such as Gregg's journal entries, the conversations with the family, her drug use, her text messages, including one text that she actually sent on the 7th of February 2024. This is when Gregg actually told a friend, "You don't understand how psycho I was that day. I almost murdered my parents." Now, Pickett believed that the low dosage of Lexapro that had been prescribed to Gregg did not cause her to commit the crimes. He said, "My opinion is that Carly does not meet Mississippi's standard for insanity at the time of the offence, and that she knew the nature, quality, and wrongfulness of her actions during that day." And when it came down to the closing arguments, the prosecution, they wrapped up strong. I'm going to say it. So they basically said, by reiterating, shall we say, the cold, calculated nature of Gregg's actions, the seriousness of the consequences that should be applied. So Newman said she retrieved the gun, waited for her stepfather, and shot both parents in cold blood. She knew exactly what she was doing, and the evidence proves it. This was not a crime of passion. This was premeditated murder. The defence, on the other hand, as they had throughout, pleaded with the jury to just see Gregg as a child, and a child who was struggling with severe mental health issues. They said, "Carly is a deeply disturbed teenager who needs help, not a life sentence." So, trying to pull on the heartstrings of those jury members to give her a chance. On the 20th of September 2024, after only 2 hours of deliberation, and we all know how it's going to go, when a jury literally pops out for a sandwich and a cup of tea, it's not going to go well for the defendant. It genuinely isn't. If they are out there for a short period of time, it means they made their minds up a long time before the summing up by the defence and prosecution. So after only 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Gregg guilty of all charges.
Verdict of the jury is count 1. We, the jury, find the defendant, Carly Madison Gregg, guilty of first-degree murder as charged in the indictment. Count 2. We, the jury, find the defendant, Carly Madison Gregg, guilty of attempted murder as charged in the indictment. Count 3. We, the jury, find the defendant, Carly Madison Gregg, guilty of tampering with evidence as charged in the indictment. Please be seated, Ms. Gregg.
When it came down to sentencing, Gregg was sentenced to life without parole, meaning that 40-year sentence she could have gone down for the plea deal. That was probably something she's going to regret not taking for the rest of her life. Like I said, she could have had half a lifetime free. Judge Dewey Arthur said this case is tragic in every sense of the word. While Carly's mental health issues are clear, the premeditated nature of this crime cannot be overlooked. The jury's recommendation of life without parole was upheld by the judge. He said, "Carly, your actions have destroyed a family and left an indelible mark on your own future. The law must reflect the severity of what you've done." One of the things that I think is really interesting before I move on from this point is her stepfather, Carly Gregg's stepfather, has spoken to her pretty much every day. He has not withdrawn his support for her in any way, shape, or form. And that speaks volumes to me. I'm not defending her actions. Please go with me down this line. You know how I am. I'm just saying, when I look at these cases, I look at them as a whole. And I think for the prosecution to bring in these apparent expert witnesses to just throw out this idea that this young woman is not suffering from some kind of serious mental health condition doesn't make any sense. It's clear that she has been. It's also clear that the way she acted in that moment contradicts entirely the experience of the stepfather and indeed the dead mother when they have spent time with this child. And I'm using the word child because she was indeed a very young person when she carried out these crimes. Not defending her. I'm just saying that I always am interested in the actions of those around these kind of defendants. The stepfather, who she could have and would have killed, still supports her and is not, I believe, happy with the full life tariff. Now, after the trial finished, Michael Smith, who was working for the prosecution, they said this was an incredibly difficult case. There's no joy in sending a 15-year-old to prison for life, but justice had to be done. Todd, for the defence, expressed disappointment and said, "I firmly believe Carly should have been placed in a psychiatric facility, not a prison. This isn't the end, and we'll continue to fight for her." And just before I finish this case, the stepfather had a pretty horrible thing happen as far as I'm concerned. So after he had been shot and survived, and Gregg had been taken, obviously, to be incarcerated, one of the things that he realised was there was video technology in the home that would have filmed certain things. So the police hadn't taken it, he downloaded it to give to the police. They literally threatened him with a charge potentially of tampering with evidence for handing it over. It's inconceivable to me that a man who's just lost his wife and had been shot himself was threatened for trying to help the police. It just goes against the grain, as far as I'm concerned, of good and kind and compassionate investigating when a man who's literally lost so gravely both his wife and his stepdaughter can be made to feel terrible for simply trying to aid an investigation. Sorry, I just wanted to point that out before I finish, because it was one of those things that really provoked a reaction in me when I was doing this research, and I find it offensive to my sensibilities, but that actually happened. Understandably, for Carly Gregg's family, for Ashley's family, and for the stepfather who clearly has lost horrendously, this case has got no winners whatsoever. The family of Carly Gregg are not happy that she's going to take every last breath in prison. And I'm sure that a lot of you listening, like me, are conflicted in this case. Listen, Carly Gregg needs to go to prison or to a psychiatric facility, maybe for a very long time. Do I believe at 14 years of age, it is not possible that she can be rehabilitated? That they cannot reform her, for example, in 40 years, as that plea deal would have offered her, making it so that she is safe to walk the streets? I think it's pretty scary when a child of 14 years of age, because that's how old she was when she committed the crime, is literally never going to get a chance of freedom. Not even a chance. I think that Carly Gregg did something heinous, evil, and disturbing, and I don't fully understand the motivations that she had for going ahead and killing her mother, who was a completely innocent, lovely human being. I don't believe for a minute that Carly Gregg was somebody who was just a cold, calculated, manipulative killer. I think that Carly Gregg was somebody who is emotionally and psychologically deeply disturbed. And if somebody is really emotionally and psychologically disturbed, then we have to think about, therefore, giving them the option to work through the emotions and the psychological distress to a point where potentially they can give back to society, they can make good on the sins of their past. And whilst it doesn't bring back the person who they've taken, it does mean that the system's worked. Ultimately, Ashley, Carly Gregg's mother, I believe, would not wish for her child to never see the light of day, to never be free again. And a system that cannot believe in the hope and reform of a 14-year-old child 40 years down the line is a system that basically admits it's broken, in my opinion. Please write in the comments if you disagree. I'm sure many of you do. I'm just remembering all the young people that I've worked with, who they were then, and how many of them changed for the better, not perfect, but for the better. And what a shame it would have been if at times people hadn't believed that they could change. When it comes down to it, without a belief in change, there's no belief in hope. And without hope, there is no humanity. Let me know your thoughts, guys. I'm sure you know a lot about this case. Please let me know if there's any information I've missed out. I always like to pick up those snippets and learn more. See you again next time. Take care.